I'm Bill Grob, Director of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois and Vice Chair of SC20 Invited Talks. Welcome to the SC20 Invited Talk session on responsible application of HPC. The overarching theme of SC20 is more than HPC. Complementing this theme, the Invited Talks collectively focus on applications and technologies impacting all areas of science, engineering, medicine, and society. The distinguished speakers in this session share their insights into some of the applications domains that have a potential to significantly transform our daily lives. Compton Tucker has been a physical scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, specializing in satellite observation of vegetation on land since 1977. He specializes in using satellite geophysical observations to study the global terrestrial carbon cycle. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Greetings, my name is Compton Tucker. I'm a scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and I'll be talking about the use of commercial satellite data, high-performance computing, big data, artificial intelligence to quantify the carbon in individual trees. My coworkers and I recently published a paper on this in Nature 2 weeks ago, where we enumerated or counted 1.8 billion trees over 1.3 million square kilometers, or about 500 square miles, and determined the crown area. This is the first of several papers which we're working on to quantify the carbon content in trees where we have trees outside of forests. I had 23 other co-workers on this paper with me. Martin Brandt was the first author. I'm the second author. It's important that we study the climate of Earth, and Carl Sagan, who was a visionary planetary scientist, coined the expression the pale blue dot to describe Earth. And that's because Carl Sagan was on the science team for Voyager 1, which was launched in 1977. Voyager 1 passed the orbit of Neptune in 1990, and Carl Sagan was instrumental in having the imager on Voyager 1 point back at Earth, where we observed Earth from 6 billion kilometers away, and it appears as this pale blue dot. It looks very insignificant, but Carl Sagan said, that's here, that's home, that's us. Everyone you've ever known has lived on the pale blue dot, all the plants and animals, and as far as we know, this is the only planet in the universe which has life. Now we have other satellites which can look at the Earth. Here is an image, a photograph taken from the International Space Station by my late dear friend Pierre Sellers, looking at the atmospheric limb at a sunrise or sunset, and you can see the thickness of the atmosphere in relation to the Earth. This is what makes the Earth the pale blue dot, our atmosphere and the scattering of blue light. Now we have other satellites which study the Earth. Here are some data of the terrestrial biosphere from CWIFS. We're able to look at chlorophyll in the oceans, chlorophyll on land, and we do this day after day, week after week, year after year, and these data are invaluable for understanding the Earth's climate. Now, as far as we know, the pale blue dot, or Earth, is the only planet we know which sustains life, and we know there are more than 1 trillion galaxies in the universe. So therefore, anything we can do to study the Earth and understand climate is in our benefit as a species, and it also benefits all the other species on Earth. So I'll digress a bit. I'm in the foreground with the glasses, looking back at the camera as a graduate student 50 years ago at Colorado State University. We were working with a spectrometer out on the shortgrass prairie, studying how different plant materials reflect light. And I show this for several reasons. This is when I started graduate school, but it's interesting to think of the computer which we used, which was interfaced to our spectrometer. So here's our spectrometer, but this was driven and controlled by a mini computer. And if you think about the capabilities at the time, this was state of the art. But for us, it now seems very primitive. This mini computer didn't have a disk drive. It only had 8 kilobits of RAM. And so you had to write your program, store your data, do everything in RAM. It had a paper tape input and output. And then it had a two-pass Fortran compiler. You used the teletype to input paper tapes. And then you had to initiate by a control panel with assembly level language and codes to start processes going. Now here is a picture of some of the hardware. And there's the paper tape reader, the paper tape punch, the teletype, and the main control panel of our HP 2114A mini computer. And all I can say is the paper tape punch was really useful because you could punch paper tapes and get what was excellent confetti. It came in very handy for many weddings, but it was very primitive. If we compare that to what we can do now, there's just several light years of difference. Now, I'll be talking today about some detailed big data, high performance computing research in the carbon cycle, and in specifically with regard to trees outside of forests. If we think of the carbon cycle, this figure is very confusing. What it shows are 3 components: the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land, and then fluxes in between as processes happen, as we burn fossil fuels, as we have land use, land cover change, emissions of carbon to the atmosphere, as vegetation photosynthesizes and sucks up carbon from the atmosphere and incorporates that into plants. And the same thing happens in the oceans with phytoplankton producing carbon compounds in the ocean, which are the basis for all the food chains there. So what we know is, in terms of carbon emissions, that only half of our carbon emissions accumulate in the atmosphere. And half go into the ocean and half go into land. And this work was started by Dave Keeling in 1958 on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, where Dave Keeling started making atmospheric carbon dioxide measurements. Dave Keeling told me once that after the first few months of making data, his readings were varying. He thought maybe he had made a mistake. He was an excellent physical chemist and very compulsive. He stayed with his measurements, and then he saw the next year the same pattern, and he realized he was seeing the breathing of the biosphere. So this is a good reason to be compulsive if you think you're right, to keep doing what you're doing, at least for a while, to see if what you're doing makes sense. And this is what Dave Keeling did, and he became very famous for doing so. Now, this slide shows that if you look above the zero line, you see our total emissions to the atmosphere in terms of fossil fuels and cement and land use change. And below the line, you see where all of those go. We have very accurate measurements of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. We have very accurate measurements of carbon dioxide concentrations in the oceans. And from that, we can calculate what goes into the land. So those are the 3 components. Now, the work I'm describing focuses on what's going into the land, where it's going, and how it's getting there. So we're looking at what's called the land carbon sink, and that means somewhere on land, carbon from the atmosphere is being incorporated by plants into carbon compounds, into wood or other plant materials. And so in the top panel, A, B, and C, you see the atmospheric concentration or sink, the ocean sink, and the land sink. This just shows you where the concentrations are and how they have varied in time. And then down below, we break out the land sink into the total on the left-hand side, and then the tropical forest component and the semi-arid component. And these are determined by numerical simulation models, which run at spatial scales of 0.5 degree by 0.5 degree or coarser resolution. So I will be focusing now on the semi-arid carbon sink. According to the simulation models, which you see on the lower right-hand corner, or rather in the center bottom in B, the global semi-arid carbon sink, these are places where moisture is limiting on the planet and where we have usually discrete trees or bushes and a modest form of vegetation, but the simulation modeling indicates these are areas where there's a lot of carbon. So what my coworkers and I are trying to do is use 50 centimeter satellite data, massive amounts of it, high performance computing, and machine learning to then map and determine where we have trees and how large they are. Now, if we go in and numerically integrate these three figures on the left, the global land sink, the tropical forest sink, and the semi-arid sink, what we find is that, and we do this integration from 1998 to 2011, and we see that the total is almost 19 petagrams of carbon, and the tropical forest value is about 12.4 petagrams, and the semi-arid carbon sink is about half that of the tropical forests. Now, let's look and see what the above ground carbon in wood in tropical forests and in the semi-arid areas are. In tropical forests, you have somewhere on the order of 14 to 24 kilograms per square meter, whereas in semi-arid areas, it's much, much less. In fact, it's 150 times less. So therefore, we have the opportunity, if we can quantify trees in the semi-arid region and how they vary in time, this will be a good indicator of moving towards quantifying carbon in wood outside of forests with scattered trees. And this is the first phase of that work which I'm reporting on. Now, this is what tropical forests look like. I worked in tropical forests. This is an image of a tropical forest in No Camp Mercado forest in Bolivia. And you see you have a lot of trees. They're dense together. They grow together densely. And this is where you have this very high density of carbon. Now, by comparison, this is what the semi-arid region looks like. This is a photograph taken in the Sahelian zone. What you see are scattered trees. There may be a few aggregations of them where you have people living, but this is what we're trying to measure at the 50 centimeter scale with large volumes of satellite data, machine learning, and high performance computing. So in our study, we analyzed 1.3 million square kilometers in West Africa from 24 north to 12 degrees north. This starts in the Sahara, it comes through the Sahelian or transition zone, then it moves down into a wetter area called the Sudanian zone, and then you finally come down into tropical seasonal forest as you go from north to south. There's a precipitation gradient of 1 millimeter per year per kilometer in the north-south direction, and so the further south you go, the more precipitation you have and the more vegetation you have. So we are trying to count trees in the Sahara Desert, in the Sahelian zone, and Sudanian zones. This is our research plan. The first thing is we use a large volume of commercial satellite data. Without these excellent data from digital globe satellites, we couldn't do this work. We organize these data during the early dry season when only trees are green and everything else is brown or is inactive because you're in the dry season. We have to form mosaics because we have to minimize multiplicative counting or else we would bias our inventory greatly. And one of our coworkers, Martin Brandt, personally assembled 90,000 individual trees for training data. That's why he's the first author on the paper, in addition to taking the lead in the analysis of the data. Then we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to identify individual trees. We had to use high performance computing or we couldn't have ever gotten any of the work done. And we had a proof of concept. It worked out. So now we're ready to expand what we're doing to other arid and semi-arid portions of the earth. We weren't sure this would work. It worked very well. I'll show you some of the results now. What we did was we used satellite data in the early dry season. So in the areas where we studied, it's a monsoonal system where you have rains in the summer and they continue to about into late September, early October, and then you enter the dry season. So we use data where the red arrow indicates for November, December, January, February, and March. The vast majority of our data were from November, December, and January. The middle panel just shows over the past 19 years, these are data from the MODIS satellite of NASA, and where you have the green spikes, those are the rainy season when you have a lot of plant growth. We perform our measurements just after the rainy season ends. The bottom figure is what I've shown before. This is what we're trying to map, where everything is dormant except for green trees. Now, when you work in sub-Saharan Africa in the Sahelian zone or the Sudanian zone, as I have, there's a marked contrast between the dry season and the wet season. In fact, you wouldn't recognize areas if you had been there in the dry season and saw them in the wet season, or vice versa. And so what we're doing is we're using the fact that we're operating just after the rainy season ends and the dry season begins to map trees when only trees are green. Now, to do this, as I mentioned, we have to take a large volume of satellite data. For our study, we used about 50,000 commercial satellite images. These were organized for UTM zone 28 and 29 from 12 degrees north to 24 degrees north. And for UTM zone 28, we started with about 24,000 images. And then when you superimpose these, as you see in the small red area, we had 459 of these images. These are 50 centimeter spatial resolution satellite images. And we need to eliminate the possibility of multiple counting. So then we form these data into a mosaic, which then, for this particular area, we went from 459 images to only 83 images with no overlapping images. If we don't do this, we bias our results by multiple counting. As I mentioned, Martin Brandt heroically assembled 90,000 individual trees. On the right-hand side are some of the trees he assembled. This is our training data, which we know these are fundamental. Good training data are fundamental for artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is what has enabled our study to be so successful. On the left-hand side of this image, you see where we had training data. They're scattered around. We represented the spatial variability of all the trees, which we were mapping by having training data and 90,000 of the training data. We used a convolutional neural network based on UNet architecture. I won't go into this in detail, but it's based on the Ronneberger et al. Paper from 2015 as modified by Persleff and Koch. And these are standard techniques in convolutional neural networks. And this was extremely useful for us. And this is what we employed, and it worked very well for our purposes. Now, here are some of the results. We're looking at a satellite image that's about 1.5 kilometers left to right and 1 kilometer north-south or vertically. And all of those green dots are trees we identified. We based our training data on the NDVI value, the normalized difference vegetation index vegetation approach, which I've used in my research now for the past 50 years, I'm embarrassed to say, but it's still a very valid technique. And with the training data, we were then able to then map individual trees. I'll zoom in slightly so we can see what we're looking at here. Here is an image which shows our study area in the upper left, and then a representation in the center. As you move towards the top in the center, we see the density of trees. And then around these images are examples of where we have different density of trees as the arrows indicate. In the far north, in the Sahara Desert, you find trees in wadis and valleys where precipitation can accumulate. As you go further south, you encounter more and more trees. But in our study, we enumerated 1.8 billion trees in this area of 1.3 million square kilometers. So here is one of our results. I have dreams seeing things like this. All these green blobs 1,837,565,501 trees. So the question is, well, so what? So you achieve a mapping like this. Well, now we have used these data to look at some basic ecological principles. And furthermore, the mapping of the tree crowns, we know the area of every tree crown. We are now working on getting the elevation of the trees so we can go to a carbon inventory over this area for the first time ever in a spatially continuous fashion. So here are some examples of where we've taken our data and we've compared them to rainfall to look at tree density with rainfall, canopy cover of isolated trees, canopy cover with rainfall. Anytime you have data like this, they can be very useful to other people for other purposes. And so we have released at the Oak Ridge National Laboratories DAC a full inventory of all of our data for people to use and how to use it, where we have all of our tree crowns. Now, in addition, you can stratify things. Here we've stratified our data to only look at trees on sandy soils. And so this is a finer resolution of the data where we have sandy soils as opposed to where we have rocky soils. You can look at something like this. Now, one of the first things you do to get some idea if you've done a good job is you compare what you have done with your training data to see what the correspondence is. We had a very high correspondence with our mapping success and our training data. And that's encouraging, and then you use that as the basis to extrapolate with machine learning and artificial intelligence over your entire domain. Now, furthermore, if you go into the Oak Ridge National DAC where we have our data, you can look at every individual tree from 1 to 1.8 billion. This is one example in the center where there's an arrow pointing to a hashed area. That is tree number 413,067. The tree crown was 189 square meters. You can do this for every tree crown which we mapped. Now you'll also notice there's not a one-to-one correspondence with this standard layer we use from QGIS, and that's because we're working at the 50 centimeter scale. The satellites are zooming by at 7 kilometers a second. And so a 1 millisecond error in time, as you translate that into the geolocation, will be an error of 7 meters. So anytime you work at a fine spatial resolution, you're going to be slightly off, but it's very easy to adjust this after the fact when you want to use the data. Now, anytime you do this, one of the first questions you ask is, well, how the hell did we do? Well, we're able to map trees, and how do you know how well you did when you have almost 1.8 billion or more trees to verify? Well, we're working with Paul Moran and the Polar Geospatial Center at the University of Minnesota on a viewer. And so these are two examples of the viewer, which Paul has been working on. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see our mapping results. And then Paul with the viewer has gone in, and when you go into each tree crown, you know the precise coordinates within several meters where that tree crown is. Paul has linked this with Google Street View, and you can see the 3 trees, which is really remarkable. So anytime you do a study like this, you think, my God, what have we done? How can we verify it? But we're working on some tools now to do that, which will also make these data very useful to people. In the bottom figure, you can see the tree which we mapped. It's a palm tree. It's in Saint Louis, Senegal. It's on the coast. And there's a tree behind it, which we also mapped. So what we've seen so far, we're very convinced that our approach is valid, and we're able to map trees and get useful information which no one has had at this scale over large areas before. In conclusions to our study, we conclude that biology and carbon can now be scaled to a planetary scale for the pale blue dot, our planet, with artificial intelligence and machine learning and high performance computing. I can't stress enough how fantastic it is to all the people who work on the hardware and software, the operating systems, everything for high performance computing. Without you, this work would not be possible. it would simply be impossible to do. So we are using high performance computing. We're using high resolution satellite data, open source software, artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, and we're using this to get information about Earth's climate and where we're storing carbon on the planet. We hope to identify where the land carbon sink is and then determine what the mechanism is for driving that so we can use that to store more carbon. This is really important for everyone on the planet, and that also includes all the animals and all the plants, because we're all in this together, and as far as we know, there aren't any other planets which are staying alive. So this work is contributing to a better use of the planet by getting fundamental climate data, which heretofore have not been available. Authors and co-authors, we had 24 authors on our Nature paper. There were many other people which contributed to this. They are at NASA, University of Minnesota, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Blue Waters, and I would like to thank Digital Globe or Maxar for excellent satellite data, the National Science Foundation, the Polar Geospatial Center where Paul Morin is, NGA, as I've already mentioned, and also Blue Waters. Here are many of the people who worked on a project. The only people who publish papers by themselves are people who work on theory. Anytime you have applied work, there are many people who have contributed to our work and the understanding of what we did. Here is a photo mosaic of them. I'm in the upper left-hand corner. Martin Brandt is next to me. Martin Brandt and I conceived this project. I handled most of the satellite data for it. Martin Brandt is the training data hero and also led the analysis. And there are many other people who have had fundamental contributions to this, and they're indicated here. So thank you for your attention and have a great day.